department, Prof. Refugee, and also the colleagues, Fadila, Pak Min, Pak Yaki, but you also be a speaker for today's general election. So I think it's such a privilege for us to welcome you here, Michelle, and also Dr. Phil and Dr. Gusnadi. It is an opportunity for us, of course, to share knowledge and experience, especially with respect to statelessness and also how the law should respond to contemporary challenges. So in our faculty, we always try to provide knowledge for our students to get some contemporary perspective. This one is on the theory of statehood. For instance, we know that there have been so many developments in this field. My background is actually on the international law, and we just recently had this final report from the International Law Commission regarding international law and sea level. And it's not only about the sea level rights, but it's also about a question of statehood and also human rights to understand. And it's very interesting to see that how these multiple perspectives, science and knowledge come together to solve the contemporary challenges and problems. And I think this one is on you, your students, and this one is the issue that perhaps you'll last for a couple of years ahead. So it's not only our responsibility, but it will be yours later on. You will be hearing this all these issues, and I think it's better for you for us to quickly, if you will, with this knowledge and perspective, and hopefully we can help you to build these contemporary and future challenges. We would also like to appreciate the cooperation that we have between Faculty of Law of Segregation and also Melbourne Law School. We have a very strong connection with Melbourne Law School, and I hope that today's lecture will be momentum for us to strengthen our cooperation further. So we hope that in terms of education, we are planning to also send some of our students to Melbourne Law School for the undergraduate fast track program. And we hope that maybe we can also arrange an event or courses where Melbourne Law School students can also visit our campus here in Melbourne to have an exchange program that would be very warming up welcoming to do so. And in addition to that, we also hope that we can expand our research network. I know that there are many issues and subjects that we can perhaps discuss about and look into it further. So we would really welcome that as well. And looking forward to more stronger fruitful collaboration with the Faculty of Law, with the University, and also others. With that, I conclude my opening remarks, and thank you very much again to the and also the person speaker and all colleagues that we have conducted for the meeting. And hopefully, this course we are enlightening with new perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this opening remarks. And we have last one opening remarks from Refugee as the head of Professional Department of Interpretation. Refugee first. Thank you very much. Good morning. Distinguished the Dean Professor Michelle Poster, Professor P. and Professor Nadita Again, welcome to the University of Pajajaran in the Faculty of Law. And this is all my students that take the subject of theory of state, as well as the subject of citizenship law and immigration law. So when a couple months ago, Professor P sent an email and informing that Dean Shah will come to Indonesia, and Professor P asked me whether Professor P is able to come to the faculty, and I just quickly said, yes, of course, we are very happy to have you as the dean, and as well as another colleague that comes from the Melbourne Law School, because it's again, as mentioned by the 5C, it's our great pleasure, it's our privilege to have you here and usually like a lecture here. And also, I'm very happy that Indonesia is able to give lecture with this topic. It's the very interesting topic, that is statelessness, statelessness and refugee law in Asia. Because there are a number of some of the important issues when I give lecture in my class, both in theory of state and citizenship law and immigration law, that most students are very want to know, are very keen about what is the status, what is the impact of the status for every person. So another thing that the students are very curious is about how about the state, how the relation between citizenship and state. There are a number of the contemporary issues that the students raise their concern. And for your information, that the faculty have a new curricula, the 2024 curricula. And also in the new curricula, we try to develop to increase the learning outcome of the what we call the program study or study program for the undergraduate. So again, this is the second generation of the new curricula that applied to them, the 2024 curricula, and we hope that the students, as mentioned by the 5 teams, that will have enlightened from the lecture, and just feel free to just raise your hand if you have any comment, any question related to the statelessness and refugee in Asia. Also, as a head of the department, I asked Pak Bilal to become a discussion for this lecture, because Pak Bilal also have a specialization on citizenship law and immigration law. Currently, Pak Bilal is doing his PhD program, taking the lawmaking of the what we call the asylum norms that regulated by the 1945 Constitution in Leiden University. And I think that this is again it's a very good opportunity for the student as well as for us here to hear lecture from the Michelle, and afterwards we also will hear the explanation or the comment from Pak. Because statelessness is one of the very important policy according to the Indonesian citizenship law that regulated by law number 12 of 2006. So the statelessness against the status of preventing statelessness is one of the important policy in citizenship law in Indonesia. That's my brief speech. I hope students you will have a very maximum advantage from listening international lecture for this morning. Thank you, and welcome to the Faculty of Law, University of Senegal. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Guru, for your opening remarks. And now, let's get start our lecture. First, I will invite the Dean of the local without question, please. Look, you guys stand here. Or? That working? That working? Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you guys for being here. This is really wonderful to be here. I've been the dean for about a year, and I've had a chance to meet in that time because I'm super busy for other things. So I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to be in front of the class. So what I thought I would do, what roughly you've heard that I'm going to be talking about refugees and status. But when I was thinking about preparing, I realised that's an enormous cost. And this is HR. So I thought that I would focus particularly on status in my presentation. We will touch on refugees, but also I think in our discussion we'll probably expand a little bit more on the refugee issue. So in Australia, the way we tend to teach in law is a little bit interactive. So I wrote some before, what you hear from you. I don't want you just to sit there thinking you don't stop talking. So I really want to engage with you and I will ask you a few questions. I'm not going to teach anyone out, so don't worry. But I really do welcome your participation and any questions at all. So please don't be shy. So what I thought we would do, we're going to be on the slide. We're going to start with a definition. We're lawyers, so we're going to be learning the law. So it's really important that we think about, well, what's the definition? What's the status of statement? And then we're going to, oh, sorry, we would say that. And then we're going to look at status indicator to look at what do we know about status? The numbers, the causes, the consequences. Then we will look at status of the international law. Because what will be is that status continues to die in the market problem, talent. Right? And so of course we want to then think about how is the international community and then finally we'll end on a hopefully a bit more positive note about what can be done. What are some of the developments? What are some of the areas of work that those contribute to the So let's start then. Thank you very much for my slides. So if you want to have the definition of a status, you would see that it's from the 1954 Convention on the Status of Status Persons. Now, some of you may know that the Refugee Convention supports the key instrument for protecting refugees. It's a 1961 Convention on the Status of Refugees. You might know that 1954, that's only 3 years later. So that might lead to there's a connection between those two. And indeed that the treaties were drafted pretty much contemporaneously, and they are very similar in the fact that they both treaties provide a set of rights for people who are either refugees, in the case of the Refugee Convention, or stateless. So what I want you to look at from a look at this definition, because the stateless person is one who is not considered as an like any state under the Statelessness law. And I've put a question there because it's different from a refugee. Now I'm not sure if you've studied refugee law, but we have some general knowledge, probably have a bit of an idea about what we think about it. Does anyone have any idea of how we might define a refugee? What are some of the key aspects? Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for I really want to I sound really discussion. But first of all, I really want to start my English is like I feel bad that I was trying to answer it. So I have read on this United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and I have found a differences are like a key differences between the statelessness and the refugee. So what I have written here, a stateless person is not considered a nation of any country, of any city, The refugee is someone who has fled their country to escape conflict or persecution and has crossed international borders. So I think that's the main difference. Is like a civil person is not considered a nation of any country, but they are not deported. They're not like their country because to escape the conflict. So I think that was my actually compliment. Thank you very much. Well done. Well done. That's exactly right. Thank you very much. Well, that's right. So let's see. There's some who has perfect country and annual and I which they have a well-founded community university for regular and nationality. So that's sort of the nature of that definition, as they pointed out so quickly, that the person has fled, they have fled their country and they reached them. Whereas if you look at the definition of a stateless person, it's nothing about it, they are not considered. So in other words, a stateless person can be stateless within their own community. But if everyone does something, everyone feels that they belong, but we may feel and yet be unable to maintain the time. So that's really important. Here's the definition and say, not considered as a national. You can't possibly trying to establish their statements. You can't prove anything. I am not something. Not I am a refugee because I am that I am not something. They're trying to prove a negative trying to prove and this is not that it's national, but we can say, how many states are there in the United Nations? 200. So imagine trying to say, well, not national, not considered national, but now you practice that. But still, that's why they got. So we can see always that there are quite a lot of people. And this means that most people, even though it's not something they're not traversing people, feel that they have a good understanding of community, that how do you whereas acceptance is definition, it's not saying that they reason. But I think that's some fine my experience, because we can know another page, they'll say, will say, how long is the economy? Big enough to do. And also, what it is, the security, we already have an understanding, someone said, we understand why. But it's interesting, what they're doing. All the stories control. Right. So we talked about some of the key aspects that they say, but of course, there is another. We can use statements in the true, because you can have a well-founded theory of persecution on the basis of nationality, and that's even that. So they can't be totally. But also in terms of the freedom of health line, the recognition from the United Nations that they can be abused. The statements can lead towards migration and towards migration. So I put this slide here, I think it's really important because people think about how to address the problem, but of course always thinking the international environment, but also locally, about what might be relevant. And it's actually the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, that is the pretty international agency for the protection of refugees as well. But also the simply agency for the state services. Now, the definition that's right, the ability to look after the papers of the market. But I think the same saying that when you expand it, really, it's expanded by the new facility. What does it say that you will say is the right to a topic? So that would you have when someone is doing HCR, you have a regulation different. The refugees, you can be a slave person, it's always categories of people, persons of concern. And so in 2014, UNHCR established a final alternative, which is designed to eradicate statelessness in Australia. So the vote people would have matched, you know, that means in the last year. So we've had a change from way once a week. So obviously, you can never find it.
And I think, like, it shows that it has had because one of the ignored, now we're seeing some pretty good changes, some pretty good work of contact on it. Like, we see a reference to the commitment themselves. Another way of understanding that we need as an international community to be doing that. Not just in the technical and legal issue, but trying to resolve on the topics that we need to research. So if I'm going to address a problem, you know, trying to say, what is this problem? So what essentially what we define as that, under where are they located? And you'll see these in the translation. But it's really to you an idea of saying, now, it's important to note that another sustains people in the world are internet. And that's how we use it. UNHCR has a pretty good idea of how many refugees there are in the world, how many slaves. But the biggest statements are very independent. We've had UNHCR, which also gives a 4 million statements. That's based on the states that are 40 UNHCR, how many states? 4 million. Yes, the states of the inclusion estimated that the world bank is a billion in my hand with money. So I have seen the UNHCR staff saying that we need to cover this and a billion. Now, not everyone that has but somewhere in the 24 billion that's enormous money. It's so hard for us to estimate how many statements we have in the world. We've got this map, some shows and many bottom. Why might it be hard? Why might we praise the contact? Why might say it's good for us to not so you need to know that. And you got that tells you your age now. We had X number of states. Why might not that be happen?
I'm not sure if this is quite enough today, but depending on my opinion, I think the number of stateless people in the world cannot be counted accurately because multiple factors. One of them can be because many stateless people are considered undocumented residents, make it hard to document, and most of them don't want to go ahead and tell the government or anyone in charge during the potential of getting kicked out of the country.
Excellent. So I think that's really excellent because you're right. The first step is that, as I've said, so many people are undocumented, don't believe my needs. They're saying what they registered. And so it's really difficult that you can't tell them you don't actually know if they are legally. So we can think about that as symbols of often very legally. People have sometimes used that label and say it's similar to the actually people. You know, they are being I think that's really important. And we are still not even but we don't go to the next slide. Way so, for example, playing in our leagues, we pay to them that they're get committed. We can't we all reporting and things like and we know that it's not right. Many in Australia, we used to report here, and then about 6 years ago, suddenly the government said, oh no, it's it. And we go to 0, and then the next year they have, and we have 8,000 cases of because the government over the political pressure otherwise. We go to the next slide, this gives you a really good idea of what the town do. So the next slide has an example of you one snapshot from the region. So you see, we've taken one piece of the region, like, for example, for the 47 and that was that was certain deliveries in the country. The 47. But other reports, particularly NGOs, media, etc., said that it was close to somewhere between 5,000 and 500,000. Foreign expenses between 400,000. So that's a huge difference. However, even more, we look at the fact that there are taxpayers who frequently statements who actually, so we reckon that of course moved to Pakistan, essentially from the but the way that the laws in Pakistan is concerned, that people have been jailed with origin are considered from the agencies. So we have up to 3 million statements people that have essentially all sentences that have been created by the state. You've got these two categories, social and writing statements, and those who effectively had this in one state. So I was actually pointed out why is it hard to measure? Where I have a situation where the Pakistan government isn't very good at thinking back and handling it. But also police, they may not want to admit that it has really meaning fatality rather than saying people, because we're very easy and it itself is creating. So the complexity of the statelessness is really showing that how can we address the problem?
Yung kapag sinabi yan yung bukas na bisa dipakai. Harusnya sih bisa bang. Coba untuk dicek ya. Gitu. Dan juga sih ada iya gimana? Ada itu.
We still have today around 54 countries in the world. There's over now US to pass on the national now, there used to be many more countries that have this nature of Russia. There are maybe people more, but they'll have more than that now. So that's just an example of this happening. That's an example of moving forward to proactive but we still have some harder and harder to second example there, but some of these statements of the demand. I know what that's wanting and when it says really and we also 75% of the world and what that tells us is often the result of racial and regional inequity. And we talked about the regional thing and that's what it's about in 1982, the money government changed the so that we always have a use effective rights or groups who are entitled to it. But in 1982, they used that word to remove the regulatory funding. So that's a very godly system, a very exclusive over the very but there are subjects that we also have migration and we also talked about that in this year. That is something we do, and it will be developed. But we also have mobile populations. For example, the most people and the mad populations birth registration and documentation are probably the most straightforward to the birth. And in that context, the statelessness can be more straightforward. So while very registration not being totally worried, they're also not. So that's where I would say the prize the individual who is more likely to probably a really urgent example of that is this is an example of what's happening in some of the media. I'm not sure if people are aware of that, it's safety in Northeast. But I think where in 2019, the safety government issued what they call the National Register of Citizens and left 2 million of that. Now, what they said was, well, if you've been left off on this at the National Register of Citizens, you can apply to the foreigner tribunal. To prove it's actually going to fair, you can be fined. And if you go to the foreign tribunal, that is what happened to a person who's been living in a country for generations. We can't anticipate many people that are off the national register in some they've been asked to quiet unrealistic, unrealistic, they're going back to 1945. We need to show that we can do the year 1945 and we need to do that. I'll talk about that say it's in the country which they think they belong, and in fact, that they don't be the rest, but suddenly they might be about it. What might it mean?
Okay, so first of all, my name is Sonia Green, and I want to answer your questions. What will happen if a person like, so there are like secrets in the country. Maybe I would more emphasize to the social feelings that they will face. Maybe they will feel like the fear of this closure. Yeah, because several person people may avoid identifying themselves because they worry about being discriminated by the person around that country. So I think that's more like the social enterprise for the national science.
It's fine, because it comes with some of the other impacts that you know, something that actually really insightful with the science. Because I think often we forget about what it must mean. No, apart from all the obvious things like the distribution, the exclusion and socioeconomic instability of the life. But this sense of not feeling to belong is really impactful. And we all want to feel like it's an innate human desire to feel like we belong, but when we do. So we're talking to be that idea of almost social isolation. I think another thing as you said is that particularly in the context of the summer, that the government is saying, oh, we're willing to we should go back to that direct, so that we possibly think of and so what the government is doing is giving people attention. And in fact, there are many it's well connected globally, innovation, but then as I touched on as well, we say there's nothing, so you sort of in the formal economy, we sort of informal and helpful. But in most states that we didn't like the large get married, you want to open the back to not have lives. There are many countries, of course, the other countries are one using but it can be to essentially it can have an exclusion from the religion. The final emerging challenge there is the courts. Now, courts have been hearing from the international community and speaking about climate change for a long time. We've also been thinking about what that might mean for innovation. But I think it's fair to say it's only really been in the last 5 years or so that the community started to look a little bit more at what it means. Obviously, in the state, secrets would exist, that's the most story. Hypothetical secrets, of course, people will likely leave their state long before there's even environment. So, being a situation, not so that not much So that's what we would say to turn to international frameworks. How we have an idea of culture, which shape us, what the causes are, some of the challenges and identifying where states and stuff. And now we're going to do that whole, how do we tackle those people? What we can do, and we can have on the year, but also the international community, something that we're for a very long time. So go back to the birth of the modern human life. Post World War II, birth of the United Nations, coming with the definition of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Si office na yan, yung mga jauh ay.
I feel that we need what we need to do from the state by agreeing on set of conditions.
Yung tadi yang itu yang
Everyone has the right to a nationality. Right? Everyone has the right to a nationality. So why do we have to talk about statelessness that everyone has the right to a nationality? What's one of the challenges of the Universal Declaration? I'm not sure how your area is quite how good. But do you have a sense of the status of the declaration? Do you think it's enforceable? Away, yeah, so it's a declaration, not a treaty. So it's not necessarily, it's not binding and such. It's designed to be, as I said, almost the first law. If any finds, it's binding form and other treaties, it will transfer at the moment. But even if it were binding, do you think that's what might be a problem with just saying everyone has the right to nationality? What do you need to actually make that right? Okay. What do you need? You just wander around the globe saying, I've got a right to nationality. What do you need? What's the sort of complementary aspect of that? Who grants nationality? The state? The government, exactly. You need to find a state that will respect that right, that will implement that right. And I don't think anyone tell us which state has the obligation to grant nationality. Because a right without a corresponding obligation isn't necessarily essential. And this, I mean, if you learn nothing else from today, or if you remember nothing else from today, this is the most important point. That states regard the ability to determine their nationality laws as an integral part of their sovereignty, a domain reserve, the reserve domain of states. The states seriously guard that. Because most states would take the view that the composition of the body politic, composition of their population is essential to sovereignty. They want to determine who belongs and who doesn't belong. And so states aren't really willing to give that up. And in fact, there's no requirement of a state having a particular type of nationality. There are lots of different ways that nationality can be granted, and a state can choose which form of nationality to adopt. And so saying everyone has the right to a nationality is wonderful, but it's not enough. What we do have in Article 15.2 is a more concrete provision. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality. So if you have nationality, you can't be arbitrarily deprived of it. So that's a bit more concrete. That's telling the state you can't take it away arbitrarily. But it doesn't say you have to grant a nationality. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that, as I mentioned, the Universal Declaration is not binding in and of itself, only to the extent that it can be done as custom, but that's not this. However, we're going to have two treaties that are specifically on status. So we've already touched on the 1954 Convention on the status of stateless persons. That, as I said, is a mirror to the Refugee Convention. That's designed to protect stateless people, largely who are finding themselves outside their country. And it has a set of rights to which stateless people are entitled. And as I said, they're almost the same as the Refugee Convention. So that's excellent and important. However, the international community sort of recognise that it has the Refugee Convention, the Stateless Convention, but that only deals with sort of the problem of statelessness, as in how do we address, how do we protect stateless people. But they realise we actually need to do more than that. We want to try to prevent, to reduce statelessness, to stop the problem in the first place.
And so we have the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. And Article 1 is a critical provision in international law because it's the only one that explicitly imposes an obligation on the state to grant nationality. What Article 1 says is that if a child would otherwise be stateless, then they have the right to the citizenship or the nationality of the country in which they were born. So that does impose an obligation on a particular state. And everyone's born somewhere. So if we did implement that consistently, universally, we would end statelessness. The problem is, this is not very highly ratified, not very widely ratified. These two treaties are only, don't even the city, that have half the number of the UN members, have ratified it. Now, since the UNHCR has implemented the I Belong campaign in the last 10 years, we've seen quite a large number of international states have ratified the two conventions. So states, even though they're quite old now, these conventions, states are still ratifying, but we don't have anywhere near enough in terms of states being voting. And I think it's because it really does challenge states' sovereignty in that regard. However, we do have other human rights treaties, and of course, as we would know, Indonesia is a party to the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And there are also treaties like the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And all of those treaties have really important non-discrimination provisions that apply to nationality. So in other words, if you're going to have a nationality law, which every state does, while international law doesn't tell you the type of nationality law, it tells you you can't fulfill it. So that has been an important way in which the absolute nature of state expression has been used. So we sort of have this distinction between state wanting absolute expression and human rights instruments pushing away that expression. We look at the limitations of international law in our region. I've mentioned that the treaties, the key statelessness treaties, are not very well ratified, and we can see that very much if we look at our region. So just look there, the 1954 Convention is only ratified by 4 states in the region. But even a country like Australia that has ratified the 54 Convention, and in fact we ratified in 1973, so a long time ago, but even Australia does not have an adequate system for identifying and protecting stateless people. We have a system for identifying and protecting refugees, but we don't have a separate category for recognising stateless people. And then if we look at the 1961 Convention, we say, well, it's only ratified by 4 countries. However, Indonesia is not a party to that convention. In practice, implements Article 1. Because you see here, that Indonesia provides you solid safeguards, specifically for children born on its territory, whose parents are of undetermined citizenship. That's essentially that Article 1, so you solve their right citizenship. That's Article 1 of the 61 Convention. And so that's just an interesting observation about international law, but while it's really important, it's not enough. Because we can have a situation where states have ratified a treaty, they don't implement it, and then we can have situations where states haven't ratified a treaty and yet in practice effectively implement something that's important states does do. So the next slide. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So I'll just try and deal with these last slides relatively briefly. I said that I would try to end giving you some sense of the work that has been done, and I've mentioned the UNHCR campaign has been critical to the work globally and including in this region. And there are some really good examples. You know, I mentioned the issue of administrative obstacles and lack of the registration. So there's some really good examples. For example, in Thailand, there is still a large stateless population, but sort of there's different stateless populations, and the Hill tribes who were stateless effectively have been granted nationality through mobile birth registration. That's been a combination of work of the UNHCR and also part of the CRPS, that's the civil registration by a statistics decade that is run over the last 10 years or so. So there have seems to be pockets of really good examples of this practice. As we say here, you know, the challenge overall is what we've already touched on. The primary responsibility for addressing problems on states. And, you know, as we said, they're often the problem. So it is really difficult. The strong sense of sovereignty is really difficult. However, we have had some good practice. So the next slide. The other thing that I think is interesting, when as lawyers, and particularly international lawyers, the temptation is always to think about problems through the sort of the prism of how international law can help. You know, what norms, what principles can we rely on, can we vote, can we deploy in our advocacy, in our litigation, you know, how can we use international law. But it is important to think sometimes we need to think more laterally about problems. And with statelessness, thinking about statelessness through a development framework has proven to be productive. So the Sustainable Development Goals have the sort of aim of no one left behind. And if you think about stateless people, well, they are the furthest behind, so most often are likely to be left behind. And so thinking about statelessness within that development framework is really important. And in particular, understanding the link between poverty and state. And that can be an argument where states may not necessarily be open to the human rights arguments, but they may be more open to arguments that it would actually be better for the economy if you gave everyone some kind of, even if it's not full citizenship, some sort of legal identity. Because then they can work legally and pay tax and be more productive members of that economy. And the World Bank has become very interesting issues that the world cites that $1 billion number. That's because in context of the World Bank really wanting to do more in this area. And we see a lot of collaborative approaches. So I've just got some examples there. You know, we have interstate initiatives. We have the national level, lots of NGOs, lots of networks, scholars, and NGOs together, trying to think about how we address those issues. And also in our region, you may have heard of Oakland, which is the regional refugee, Asia-Pacific Regional Refugee Network. That's been going for decades. But more recently, you've seen stateless-specific networks. In particular, Nationality for All, which has now become unified coalition. And just the next slide. This is showing you, I suppose, the extent to which statelessness has come onto the agenda of the UNHCR. The Nansen Award is an award that's given annually to someone who is determined by the UNHCR to undertake really exceptional work. And this is an amazing woman from Nepal who's spent decades advocating against the discriminatory nationality laws in Nepal. Still one of the countries that discriminates against women in nationality laws. So that really just shows, you know, the extent to which statements and have sort of been elevated as an issue. And then just the last couple of minutes, I thought I would just talk a little bit about what we're doing at Melbourne Law School, because we're law students and we have our law students very involved in clinical work in statelessness. So the Peter McMullen Centre on Statelessness is, as the name suggests, focused on statelessness. We're in a university context. We established the centre about 8 years ago, really out of the recognition that statelessness, as you've been hearing today, is a really important issue. But it's one that hasn't really, I think, attracted particularly the academic attention that it deserves. And up until we set up the centre, there wasn't any other centre in the world, you know, university. And so we started to think about what sort of the usual things like training PhD students and teach about statelessness. But one of my colleagues realised that there was an opportunity for our students not just to sit in a classroom and learn about statelessness, but actually be involved in resolving statelessness. And the context is that Australia, I mentioned, has ratified both statelessness treaties, and I critiqued Australia a few minutes ago because I said we don't properly identify and protect stateless people. But what we do have is similar to Indonesia, we have that youth solely provision. So in our citizenship law, it says if a child would otherwise be stateless, they get Australian citizenship. So we have that Article 1 of this one convention in our law. However, a lot of people don't know about it. A lot of refugee lawyers will help the refugee families, but not realise that they're working out how the individual refugees can get protection through a visa. So they don't necessarily realise that the children may be eligible for citizenship. And so what we do in the clinic is to take on those clients. So we have a rector of refugees now across the nation who will have heard about the Stateless Legal Clinic, and they will form meetings with the rest and they'll say, we have a client for you. And they're often brand new babies, or they might be 1 or 2 years old. So they're very cute clients. And then our students enroll in the clinic and they provide that legal assistance to the families that enable the children to become Australian citizens. And I can tell you it is the most amazing work. I mean, it's not the most complex legal work, but in terms of outcomes, many of these families tell us we have ended intergenerational statelessness. Because these are families like Rohingya families, Palestinian families, Somali Kurds. These are people that have never known in their generations citizenship anywhere.
and then they come to the state and they're able to. So it is an issue that I think once people to learn about, they want to get involved in because it's very compelling. So I've probably talked enough, but thank you for being very engaged, and I think we've got hopefully quite a bit of time now. So
I think from your very first, yeah.
we offer a few remarks or do we set up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Can you speak up from here? It's funny because I am studying of issues about the statelessness of the refugee, and I think we also can ask about how can it is impacting affecting the national law and how Indonesia as a country state, because not of it is on Google to Australia and the Indonesia as a country state, and how the Indonesian law can respond to this phenomena, to the immigration phenomena. And I think probably we have to play all of that into. So I think we're going to go here. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's an honor also for me to be here with Potter. Like this is one of the leading scholar on statelessness studies. I've asked my students on citizenship law courses to read your introduction of the book, Statelessness, yeah, and I hope there will be some question from you. I'm really hoping that. Instead of discussing your lecture, I will present another topic. It is also related. It is about refugee in Indonesia. But of course, it's really intertwined with the statelessness issue. But I think I also encourage students to maybe consider to take statelessness topic as their minor listen for the research because understanding in English. Yeah, so I really encourage it to do research on that topic. So this is
Yang depan tuh
presentation I would like to talk with you
bukan sih
about
rebel
decisions, and then we talk in a brief refugee in Asia, including Indonesian populations and also the countries where they are live, and then positions as Indonesia as a non-signatory country of refugee convention, and then our asylum and refugee laws and policy in Indonesia, and also some of my finding from the field and from the statement of the refugee. So next slide, please. Professor Potter already explained about what's different between the refugee and also the stateless people. Yeah, it's sometimes intertwined, but the main maybe criteria for the refugee is, as you said, some students said, it's they have a well-funded persecution in their own country, yeah, because of the some several reasons in the refugee convention. There's a for particular grant for people get the refugee status in the foreign countries because of the race, religion, nationality, membership, or particular group or political different political opinions. It can be also for people who don't have any nationality. Yes, so it's also what the Professor Foster called as a set refugee. For example, in Indonesia, we have Rohingya, and then I think a long time ago, I took a fight with Professor Tutu, one student who were the students, minor students, on the right to nationality of Rohingya refugee. And then she found that when she did a fieldwork in Medan, that it's the question is like whether this Rohingya child born in Indonesia can get Indonesian nationality. And then the bureaucrat said that yeah, of course, the viewer in the law, yes, you have a person born in Indonesia without we know the parent status of nationality can give them Indonesian citizenship status, but we don't have any procedure on that. That's all the most problem, but also it's mixed with the problem of unwillingness to give citizen status, because if someone has status or nationality, there will be mutual rights and duties. And to some extent, for Indonesia, it's we have a lot of people that still perceive foreigner as a burden. They have to be like our citizens. So, and then also we have another set of populations in the Eastern Indonesia, but it's not non-displaced settlers. So there's a province close to the Philippines. So they have the border sea, border there, the Sangihe, the total Sulawesi. There's a lot of population, around 1,000, who has a mixed background, families with Indonesia and Philippines, and they don't have any clear nationality. So I think government will work on that, and UNSO also work on this issue also. In addition to the work with the refugee. So, if we read the conventions, it's a status of protections, and legally sometimes it's distinguished between refugee and the asylum seeker. So, asylum seeker technically or legally is someone who seeks refugee status, asylum. It's the understanding. And but the second is not determined yet as a refugee. So it's also close connected to the asylum institution and protection. So once individual granted as a refugee, they have protection from other countries, which is called asylum. So refugee is a person who given asylum from other their own country or from the foreign country. So and then it's not including the internally displaced person. So a lot of people, displaced people in Indonesia also have to flee for their city because of disaster, and then because of we have that kind of population like in Madura. There's a religious conflict there between Shia and Sunni, and then some of the Shia population have to move to Java. They call it as internally displaced person. So technically it's a refugee, so we call it as internally displaced people. But in general, they are all displaced person. And then in Indonesia, it's also generic. The term refugee, in Indonesia we call it pengungsi. It's a generic term for displaced person. So we talk about refugee in the sense of the physical convention, we give a special term as a pengungsi dari luar negeri, or the refugee from abroad, or a foreign refugee. So that's also another thing I would like to emphasize. And then this is, you can see, I got this from the regional, I think, migration trend, 2024. So, yeah, as Professor Foster mentioned, in terms of statistics, the UN has provided mixed and maybe not accurate number of displaced persons because of the change of the status and the status moving. So we have here in the Asia Pacific regions, 17.3 million in total, but we have 72 million refugee and including asylum seeker population, and 225 million stateless people. Maybe I think also the number is not too accurate. It's, yeah, of course, it depends on the methodology we use to count this. It's designed, so it's quite big populations. So I think in globally we have like for 51, I think last year 51 some point something billion refugee and asylum seeker population globally, and then Asia Pacific holds 14%. So it's quite big number for that region that most some of countries are not parties to the refugee convention, including Indonesia. And next. So we are refugee in Asia, you can see also from the map. We only hold like 12,000 around there, and never like we reach more than 50 since we hosted that number of refugees in 1990s Vietnam administration. So after that, we only like yeah, maximum like 15. I think like in the thousands, I think, and now it's only 12,000. So it's quite small number compared to our neighboring countries such as Bangladesh, Thailand, and also Malaysia, who was 100,000. Even in Bangladesh, in the Pokebuzzer camp, they host around 1 million, 1 million. Some of them due to attack. If you know the Rohingya refugees, they are from secondary movement, not from Myanmar, but from from Bangladesh. They tried to go to Malaysia, but sometimes they stranded in Aceh because of the sea or, smuggler, they left them, and then, in the hope that Indonesian government will help and, give some solution for these refugees. So it's not big. And then Indonesia is non-signatory. Published edited volume. I contributed one chapter on this book. It observed the non-signatory countries of the Refugee Convention, including in Indonesia, but I mean, it's quite a big number in Asia. From 49, they call it Asia Pacific region. It consists of 49 nations. It's only like 21 states that have ratified or acceded to the Refugee Convention, not including Indonesia. In Southeast Asia, we have three, I think, Cambodia, and then Timor-Leste, and then Philippines, but they don't have any significant number of refugee population compared to non-signatory states, like Bangladesh, India, Thailand, and Indonesia, for example. And then, but this non-signatory state hosts a lot of refugees. As I said, Bangladesh, Thailand, and then Indonesia in the past, we host Vietnamese, Chinese refugees. It's I think 100,000 people hosted in Galam Islands in Riau. And then we also after that host a lot of Middle Eastern refugees, mostly from Afghan. That's what Yogi said. The intention was to go further to Australia. So this Indonesia, some narratives say that this is nothing short, but decision making to move is quite complicated. Not one motive. So I think it's complex reason people go out of their country to seek protection because it saves your life, right? So you don't really have real reason to go out of the country to have a better life. Just go from your country, something like that. And then we also studied from 2009, a lot of Rohingya from Myanmar lead to neighboring countries, including Indonesia. Most of them before that already crossed the country to Thailand, who has the land border with Myanmar, and then some of these refugees probably come to Malaysia because they have quite big and long, quite long Rohingya community in Malaysia since 1970 because of Malaysia also not specifically because of they call it Muslim solidarity. They just let it, the Rohingya people to go, and also they get benefit from that for the labor force that work in the a lot of informal work there in Malaysia. So a lot of Rohingya also in Malaysia, but I think since the persecutions in Myanmar quite escalated, and then in the peak, if you maybe heard, in 2015, we had the mini crisis in the Andaman Sea, where I think like around maybe 8,000 Rohingya mixed also with the Bangladesh Sea, they stranded in the Andaman Sea. And some of them, like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, the three most affected countries, who after that decided to host temporary Rohingya. So that's also the turning point of Indonesian refugee policy from really reluctant to accept the conventions, host refugee because of funded by Western countries, but now they have to face that the population are also their people, Asian people. So they have to improve their refugee policy. So, but because they are mostly not, non-signatory state to the convention, so the protection, international protection, is mandated uh, to UNHCR, like said Professor Foster said. And then because UNHCR is not, fund everything about refugee, and Indonesian's government policy is quite restrictive. So refugee in Indonesia up until now, they are not allowed to work. If you work, or it's also applied to every foreigner who doesn't have work permit, working permit. You will get detained in the IEC, something like that. So mostly they have defended their own setting, and then some, I think in the past, most of them like have the living allowance from the IOM, it's from the Australian money, and then they stopped in 2018, and after that also in 2013, 14, Australia really closed the border, the sea border, and then with the operation of southern border pass through, when the orange food, when the refugee boat came to Australian sea, and then it's intercepted by SNFD, and then they will turn back to the origin country, like to Indonesia, and to the set orange food. And this makes also deterrent effect for refugees not coming again to Australia by sea. So after 2014, there is no significant flow refugee or asylum seeker from Indonesia to Australia by sea. So they have to deal with this. And yeah, of course, we still think about how to protect them in the minimum sense, because having also provide a lot of funding on them. So we're still discussing on how, if whether we give some extent the right to earn some money in order to survive this, something like that. And then in my chapter I try to explain why this consistency of Indonesia not to sign the refugee conventions. So some of the previous works have identified there's a major reason is because refugee perceived as burdensome economically, especially. That's also pop up in my research, but I found some other factors that influence Indonesian non-signatory states. For example, the transit country narrative, which is not applicable anymore because they couldn't go to Australia anymore. So transit to where? So it's like transit to nowhere. So the fact of Indonesia is already a destination country for refugees. The recent, of course, refugee from Romania. Yeah, but we still have to find the solutions on that. So, but this narrative is still on the table. They justify non-signatory sense because Indonesia consistency. And then the second one is in bureaucracy. Some of the department, the ministry wanted Indonesia to accept this convention. And also like the Indonesian Commission on Human Rights, Komnas HAM, they push also in order to protect refugee adequately, they push the government to ratify actually the convention. But most of the government, they reject this idea. But I found the narrative my interview that it's quite not balanced, but it doesn't mean that all the actors in Indonesia doesn't want Indonesia.
Gue mau nanya bang, cuman Inggris gue jelek kan? Gue nanya perbaiki grammarnya.
Advocates, especially those who keep in touch with the NGOs and with the Komnas HAM.
Coba lu tanya gue pakai bahasa Indonesia.
The advocate.
Itu orang tuh mau nanya.
And then
Gimana kita melindungi orang yang dia tuh ada di suatu negara yang dia belum ngerti keberadaannya. Maka itu termasuk orang yang
action plan in Indonesia. The plan is ratified.
kayak Rohingya maksudnya kayak Palestina.
But at least
Oh di sebuah negara yang negaranya nggak diakui gitu.
in
How can
all
we protect?
human manners
So,
and
and
etc.
can we
Is
consider
bigger,
that situation?
not only from
Stateless.
domestic but
Oh,
also international.
kalau
They have to
dipindahkan kan
compromise.
status kayak orang yang
At the
dia
end,
juga punya
after the
dari
Rohingya
ini kan
crisis
suaka
in
keseluruhan
2016,
all buat
the government
science
enacted the
strictness.
presidential regulations
Gue bisa
on refugee, which is
so
I see this as a
proses
compromise,
aja. Jadi
as a compromise between the push to ratification to obsession
pasti
and then the
yes
need
kayak
of the
misalnya what
bureaucracy to
if
deal with the
the
refugee system.
citizen
In folklore of
that doesn't
not only
doesn't
citizens,
recognized
so they have
by
to compromise
United
on this
Nations
by making the presidential
permanent
regulation.
member gitu-gitu.
And then the last one, I found an important sentence.
Packing
So
ambiguity.
yeah, of course the burden
Iya.
factors perceived at the
Tanya bahasa Indonesia, terus lu suruh dia bikin pertanyaan bahasa Inggris. Ya itu dia ngerti.
It's really rooted in the Indonesia colonial history. It is at the time, I think, in colonial era, the Dutch brought a lot of Chinese capital and also the labor to compete with the local labor, which is, resulted a lot of operations, low-wage labor and something like that. And then after Indonesia got independence, I think the first Indonesian immigration law said that we now standing with not anymore with the open door policy they on immigration, but we are now having the principle of selective policy. So migrants is number second. We are prioritizing our citizens. I see this principle is still on the table. It's still in the Indonesian current immigration law. That's also influencing factor that Indonesia not really engaged formally with the international refugee law. This is the Indonesian refugee asylum and refugee law. I said asylum because it's selective. We have, for example, the narrative and our Indonesian bureaucracy is the whole refugee is based on the Pancasila. It's based on our humanitarian principles. Also, we have a constitutional asylum policy in the Indonesian constitution, which is right there. And it could be claimed by foreigners to ask asylum. But yeah, when I asked it in my interview, they don't, no, we are not based on this right asylum. We just base this, our practice based on the humanitarian principle in order maybe to, to retake the consequence responsibility to provide a lot of rights to refugees. And then we also have human rights law, almost the same. Next. So we have also almost the same. It's just that we are not a country of refugee convention, but we have almost the same definitions of refugee, and it's also including asylum seeker. So it's a quite progressive for me because after this regulation, you want to take also another. Status if the refugee would like to resettle in other country. So we have adopted some sense of principle of international refugee law in our national regulations. Yeah, and then next. Yeah, but in the practice, even after the purpose, the PR, the president regulations already enacted, the major law that used by the official is still the immigration law, which is framing refugees mostly because they are undocumented as irregular or illegal migrants. And then they also act even internal or I don't know, it's like maybe the right directive in immigration's directorate, which is after it's almost the same enacted after the presidential regulation, but it still framed the refugee as the irregular migrant. So that's also the problem. But after the PR, the president regulation, we have no agency involved in this matter. But before that, only like immigration still were there, and then maybe lately when it comes to a refugee comes from sea, and other like local government who where the refugee is located. You know, they can eradicate the silent tendency in the nation's refugee progressive. And then since this PR is like, finished, finally enacted in 2016, which is influenced quite significant by the crisis in 2015, it's mostly focused on emergency situation. So it's quite interesting in Indonesia. I found the narrative that if people come to Indonesia with high grant, for example, they don't come to them as a refugee. So who said it? Refugee is like Rohingya. They come by sea. So it's like a little bit, I don't know, maybe this is the major perception in Indonesian bureaucracy. Perceive refugee only in emergency situation because of the mode of their life. And this influenced by the presidential regulations. And then in the past, we pay a lot of revenue in the IDC. It is also funded by the Australian funding at the time. But now after they have the money, refugee all release, and then they have to live with the yeah, some of them still live in the community hall, but still, IOM Asia also less funded, but also then they have to, thinking a lot of things to get a lot of another funding. Like for example, they have no funding from the EU and the US, but now the US takes the policy and then something a lot of complexity happen facilitating the refugee. And then we have a clause in president regulations that the treatment of a refugee can be funded by the state budget. But when I went to an interview some official, then they said, no, it's not for the refugee. It's not, it's for the official when they have the operational cost to labor. So it's like, oh, so you don't give any money? No. It's not our responsibility. So the narrative is still the same. And then, of course, in general, I found that refugee in Indonesia now is still have limited rights, but also it depends on the discretionary practice of the official. I found in some region in Indonesia, even the IDC official, they are quite have a hospitality to the refugee. Say, I went to some place in Makassar, and I accompanied with the one immigration official, and then we talked, and then they he told me there's a food stall there owned by the refugee. So you can no, they don't bother with society, just leave it. But I found later that the leader of the IDC is quite has what is it called? Like they are immigration official, but he has a lot of empathy to people, including refugees. So in his opinion, if it's the refugee do not bother the society, just go ahead. It's like condoning people, condoning refugees to do some illegal things in Indonesian law, like working or something like that. But before that, another IDC leader, I thought it's very strict immigration law, and a lot of refugees became in IDC, and then resulted in huge protests in Makassar at the time. And then after that, the Central Bureau of the Immigration had to change that leader into another new one. But really this situation is effective. So as a situation, refugee is, I think, as a passive object, they don't have really active ability to play their rights. So I think that's all my presentation. I would like also to invite you to discuss the project proposal in the Q&A session. Thank you, Pak Yopi.
Next part of our discussion session. Maybe first I will open for the three discussion for three questions that you want to ask or to deliver to us. Okay, one, two, three. Okay, first call that and you and you.
Okay, thank you so much, Michelle and also Fabiola for the insightful presentation. I would like to ask to Michelle, because on your work here, you stated that there is a need for a deeper research into the relationship between one's minority status and statelessness, and also how the state can use their power to grant and remove citizenship status. This is very interesting because how can the state regulate, a migration law, but they're also facing the challenge as what Fabiola said as the, colonial history in Indonesia. In our reality, when it comes to talk about refugee, we talk about Rohingya, and some of those people in Indonesia have this kind of like social jealousy to, to the refugee. Uh, what if someday in the future they become more wealthy than the people that was born and raised in Indonesia? So there's just like a social jealousy there, and also a lot of challenge faced by the government to ensure that the citizen of Indonesia will accept the refugee itself. Because, even if we openly welcome the refugee, there will be a lot of challenge for them to be part of Indonesian society, because there's gonna be like internal exclusion for them, even though they already have exam and so on. And talking about refugee, how if the refugee lives in Indonesia, how can the state provide their needs? Like, we're talking about the funds, right? How do we live and how we invite them to live here in Indonesia? That's quite challenging, because in fact, there's still a lot of Indonesian people who live in poverty. So I would really like to know your perspective on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Next, yeah.
Thanks for the opportunity. My name is Georgia. So I think accepting refugees can also be seen as something building, especially for developing countries. And one of the greatest is represented in the capability of the refugees to be productive and work in high skilled labor areas. So I just want to know your opinion, Fabio and Michelle, on how do countries balance their national interest and international humanitarian responsibility on managing the integration of urban refugees. Thank you.
Okay, last one.
Okay, thank you. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Harini. So my question is specifically about the human rights implications for stateless people regarding access to education, healthcare, employment, and freedom of movement. And I also want to know specifically about how does statelessness affect children who were born in refugee camps or in conflict zones. Thank you.
I think I will take it as many things that is related to the conclusion and yeah, sometimes people so see the village society. And I think it makes a lot of people that in Australia about the flowers of water and they think that it means that for them and a lot of IT for region in Australia and also Indonesia and around the world, I think that's or that that how that we have the innovation policy and the country countries of them to protect the people.
Great, thank you so much for those wonderful questions. There's so much in there, but I might sort of group them together and go over that as well. I mean, just for that last point, you're absolutely right, and I think that's why I was talking, I was struck by how similar things both are, in so many different countries, even though the conflicts may be different, the level of resources, in Australia, Indonesia, our representation of treaties is different, and yet so many different, so, as well, I will start with that, because I think what we're really doing here is a theme around burden sharing and responsibility sharing. And I think you're quite right to point out just how complex it is. I think, as you say, there are these complexities, there is this tension between the commitment and the responsibility of the state to its own citizens, versus those who have arrived, when there's, I think, a sense that people are arriving sort of without authorization. And that's certainly the debate in Australia, with the people who are arriving, refugees who are arriving by boat, don't have a visa, so they sort of have been invited, in that sense, and I imagine that some of the same debates happening here. Then what's interesting is that the refugee convention is established exactly to deal with that scenario. So one of the things in Australia is that there's a sense that there is a good refugee, the refugee who comes through a resettlement program. So a resettlement program is essentially where Australia talks to the UN High Commission for Refugees and says, now, we have 20,000 places that we're going to dedicate this year to refugees. You, UNHCR, tell us who we should bring. You know, we rely on UNHCR to make a determination of refugee status, and then we bring those people to Australia. So that's sort of a good way to arrive, because it's orderly, predictable, Australia gets to determine the term of that resettlement. Now, the trouble is that's not paid by the refugee convention. That's the sort of discretionary vote program, if you like, which is great. No one's going to take a resettlement program. The difficulty is when that is committed against the bad refugees who survive without a like by vote. And yet the irony is the refugee convention only deals with that latter scenario. Because if you think about the context, the refugee convention was designed at a time when the international community was looking back at what happened and ended up during World War II, when boats were turned away, you know, infamous boats that were turned away carrying hundreds of Germans, sort of 8,000 people to have that's and there was this saying that we should never turn that boat there. You know, we really have to consider that idea that we accept people as they arrive. Having said all that, the trouble is that results in a disproportionate burden for countries that have the least resources. So if we look at this, they're focusing on our region, but if we look globally, we see that 85% of the world's refugees are the lowest income countries. And that has become worse over time. So when I first started thinking of people, I did years ago, it was about 70%. And now it's 85% refugees in the country, but only able to afford and coming back to the refugee convention, I said it doesn't have a resettlement program, and it also, although it recognises in the preamble that international cooperation is absolutely critical to refugee protection, there's nothing in the convention that requires international cooperation. And so that is really a impact in the refugee convention. So what we need then is schemes like resettlement schemes, the regional responsibility schemes that we properly recognise the benefits for these schemes encouraged by countries like India. And I think what we can see in other parts of the world are responsibility sharing arrangements, and there's no perfect example. It can't be one where I say that's a perfect example. But other regions have established schemes and getting a little bit more burden sharing. And it's in our region, unfortunately, Australia is probably the country that's most able and in the best position to help to establish our idea of responsibility sharing is really the responsibility. So our government talks a lot about, we need a regional solution, but the regional solution is to set up detention centres in our room and putting people on playing the work. So I think all of the concerns we're raising are those values, and I think we're not going to be that we need to set up a scheme that more properly shares responsibility. What the international community, I'm just talking about the phrase international community, so it's a really modern thing. But I mentioned very early on in my slides the global compact on refugees.
And that is not a treaty, it's a compact, it's an agreement between states. And that's exactly designed to respond to this problem. And it really, I mean, unfortunately, it arose out of the European crisis. We had a lot of very July in Europe in 2015. Many people aligned. But nonetheless, we had many states, almost every state, agreed to this compact. And the idea is that it is supposed to be sort of redistributing the between different states. Now, I heard from the former Assistant High Commissioner of Refugee, Gillian Tripp, who spoke at my hospital last week, and she was only finished her term about a month ago. And she was saying authorities include examples emerging in Kenya and from other countries in Africa, where this global compact does seem to be making a difference. I'm yet to see it really making a difference in our region, but it is only 2018, and yes, that's a few years ago, but those things take time. So I think there is a recognition of all of these challenges, but we know really near being in a position to properly address them. I think the other missing piece is a regional human rights framework. So we have the Asian Declaration of Human Rights, and then defined human rights regulations in the system. And I think that was certainly made a difference in Europe. European Convention on Human Rights has provided really underpinnings that are planning on protection in Europe. So that's, I think that probably sort of deals with a lot of the issues around, how we can sort of acknowledge these challenges and how we can deal with them. I think the point about integration into society, I mean, that's a challenge everywhere, but I think you just need to recognise that it does take a lot of resources. So I mentioned our resettlement program in Australia, and it is an excellent program. I mean, I am very critical of the Australian government in lots of ways, but our resettlement program is excellent, but it's very resource intensive. We provide an enormous amount of resources. I'm sitting on the board of one of the main resettlement agencies. And, for example, individuals will have, 300 hours of intervention and reconstruction, hosts that provide access to housing and help. It's very resource intensive. And so I think that needs to be recognised, that we can't expect people to integrate, and we can't expect the local community just to accept without really properly resourced and carefully formulated and managed. So, I think that's probably the main points.
On anti-immigrant threats, colonial history. Yeah, I think what I found in my research is this kind of tendency is also happening in Western countries in Europe, for example, but it has different regions. I read it's more a sociological book written by Polipolitical Griffiths. It's about humanitarian borders, and then the arguing in this book that this kind of denial to migrants, especially research on denial at the borders and the sea borders and the humanitarian problems in the Mediterranean Sea, for example, and then it's a little bit on the philosophical state, and it's rooted in the what we call as whiteness, white supremacy. And it's why it's highly convincing that's why I used to read the book. And then, but I found in Indonesia we have a different reason that while in the Western maybe like what the Trump promoted now, it's really like whiteness, white supremacy. But in the global south, we see that colonial history as oppressed by foreigners. It's also, encouraged maybe unconsciously spirit of the immigrant. So we have reasons and that reason on that reason the difference. So whiteness in the West, colonial history in the South. And then it's a bit also difficult to we have approached, as I agree with this, about integrating refugees in society. But the problem is in Indonesian very closely also promoted this kind of perception, anti-immigrant policy. So when I interviewed immigrations, and then before that they didn't want to interviewed by me, and then I was like told by one of the former immigration officials, and this guy was interviewed, and he asked me, so you advocate refugees? Can I see your passport? You still green or not? Something like that. So when you advocate people he needs, and the perspective is really suspicious. And I
go to, I don't know, so but I just want to make it easy. And it's kind of response is reflect, I think, anti-immigrants, anti-foreigners due to the colonial history. And it's not only in Indonesia, I also, yeah, I just some, like, for example, in India, Pakistan, border is also federal bill, because of the partition is not logical at the time. And then the point is not considered in the fact that the refugee convention, so it's excluded from that sports. And then also in the Philippines also, but then there are of course the part of the conventions, but still the discourse in the country it's still also echoing the colonialism as the country of the former colony of the Spanish and then after the US country. So it's not easy. So I think yes, we have to promote a more, I don't know, push the government to take the discourse when we communicating with refugees in well, treat them as humans, not as a threat, not as a threat. So this is the hostile response. Also, when we look back last year and the time of the election, so the Rohingya refugee was also one of the topics. It's not a difference. Maybe also like it's actually the issue, but not in Indonesia. So one of the candidates, I suppose, it's one of the can use this issue to get votes for. And then it resulted to anti-Rohingya movement at the time. We did a lot of report to conduct on that and on the issue on the media, social media and something like that. And the government still promoted the kind of this is really yeah, it's not a good and positive response if we want maybe not to be integrated fully, yeah, but yeah, we are treating them well as when we are still in nature, we still have to promote a more constructive dialogue with the Indonesians. So we can avoid sometimes not only social jealousy, but the violence to them and the violence between Indonesians and migrants who almost happening in Aceh at the time of the elections. It's, I think it's like to assess. Okay, I think three more questions, right? Is it okay? Okay, I think on one, two, and three. So, I am in for like moving from now that because I think it's one of the main problems that happen in India. So I would like to ask the student refugee population thinking about the issues that question. First of all, of course, thank you to Pamela and Professor Michelle for the presentation earlier. It was very insightful and wonderful. Um, Before I ask my question, I wanted to point out my thoughts. Earlier, Professor Michelle, you pointed out that there are several conventions about statelessness. Two of them are the 1954 and 1951 conventions about statelessness, in which many countries, particularly in Asia, including Indonesia, haven't ratified the convention. Thus, these countries have no obligation to handle the statelessness populations, right? And furthermore, it could be said that several countries are purposely misleading, I think, its reports to further their political agenda and also to avoid responsibility. And lastly, although there are regulations and treaties relating to the human rights and statements about statelessness populations, I think that there isn't really law enforcer of international law. Like per se, if there is a country who got sanctioned because of its discrimination towards certain minorities, in this particular statelessness populations, the international community can do much, such as using the use of force, and because it will violate the country's sovereignty. So there's this dilemma of wanting to eradicating statelessness, and there's also the presence of countries wanting to keep stateless populations for its own agenda. So how could the international community deal with this dilemma? I think that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. So it was mentioned earlier that the statelessness here in Asia is still overcome. So how does this, I would like to ask, how does this affect the effectiveness of international policies in protecting refugees and stateless persons? Also, do you think this is mainly due to technical issues or there are other aspects, such as maybe particle codes to deliberately avoid breach? Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That's a wonderful question. So I'll probably just take them in order. So I think the first question is really kind of fascinating. So that question essentially around whether the current international refugee framework adequately allows for an opportunity for refugees to participate. I think it's a very timely question because I think that things have changed a lot. We think that we're well in the last few decades. I mean, interestingly, there were some people who experienced refugee court who were involved in drafting the refugee convention. So refugees were involved in the beginning, but then for a very long time, very ignored in the implementation of refugee law. So I would say over the last 10 to maybe 15 years, and I'm not really sure exactly what explains it, one of these things sort of has come on gradually. There's been more and more understanding that we need to hear from people with lived experience. And we see that now very much at the international level. So the UN High Commissioner for Refugees now regularly involved people with lived experience in all sorts of roundtables and sort of opportunities for policy development. We also very much see it at the national level, and of course I cannot speak for every state. So I know in Australia the government has set up sort of an insert panel that is comprised of people with lived experience who feed into a ministerial roundtable. So I think there is more and more understanding that we really, and I think that's very much the refugee law, I see disability, and a whole lot of other areas as well. There's a growing recognition that people who are experiencing illegal regime need to have some sort of mechanism for feeding into that. So I think we still have a long way to go, but it needs some time for that perspective. In fact, there's several people now writing PhDs from the moment. So they're really interesting questions. Should I just go through it? Yeah. In terms of the second one, I mean, it's a huge question about, what do we do? I mean, in terms of your right that very few states have ratified the sea conventions, I wouldn't start solely around how overall they go, because I mentioned the other key human rights treaties, including the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. And I think it's fair to say that, all of those treaties, the CTR, CEDAW, PRC, and the IPED, so all of those key treaties are relevant to nationality and statelessness because in some cases they explicitly have a provision, particularly around a child's right to nationality, but they also have these important non-discrimination provisions. So that's always been the case. So I think it's fair to say that it's only been quite recent that the relevant bodies, like for example the Human Rights Committee that oversees the implementation of the ICCPR, has come to sort of to really educate on this issue. What I mean by that is that when states present themselves every so often, that is those periodic reviews where a state says, here's how I'm complying with my obligations. The Human Rights Committee is much more active now in seeing human rights or sending statements through human rights lens, and I think that's partly because of advocacy on the part of organisations like the Institute of Statelessness and Inclusion and other such organisations that are sort of advocating for those bodies to think about human rights. And I know your response might be that how it's enforceable, and of course that's possible. But I think that what can happen is that countries tend to change into enforcement. So, the Human Rights Committee said, in the case of the Netherlands, for example, I've maybe done a conclusion about 3 weeks ago, for
versus the Netherlands. And essentially, the Netherlands, it's refusing to recognise stateless refugees as stateless. And it kept saying, oh, we understand his nationality, so therefore we don't have to ever recognise it. And the Human Rights Committee said that's a violation of the child's right to nationality. And so now the Netherlands has set up a proper status determination system. That's a really good example of a state that has recognised its obligations through being trained. Effectively, even though there's no national police that can go in there or wait to enforce something more morally. Of course, that doesn't start a new way. I've got a student who can actually read something on alternative approaches to statelessness. So I think that there are people trying to sort of think about, okay, if state is the problem, so maybe we have to look at, and her thesis is called Beyond the State. And she's thought about things like, regional citizenship on one hand, specific citizenship on the other. So I think, I know that some of you are students of theory and state. So I mean, there are lots of really interesting debates around is the state a problem and therefore do we need to look beyond the state. So that's a much larger project. But yeah, really great question. And then I think the final one was about the numbers and how that affects our attempt to address statelessness. I mean, it really affects it, and that's really at the heart of the problem. But I think what we are seeing is a lot more work, the UNHCR's campaign, I didn't have time to go through it in detail, but it had 10 action sort of points. And one of them was better qualitative and quantitative information on status. And the UNHCR has supported many projects over that time. The Health Centre has been involved in some, but there is quite a lot of work being done in the region. Lots of NGOs, I mentioned the Nationality for All, and sort of more traditional new organisation, but they got this great report called SEA, which is SEAP, basically something specific, and that sort of got a country by country analysis, which trying to pull together information about each country and what the status populations are and where they are. So there's a lot more effort being dedicated to this section of identifying the population. Maybe not trying to get the exact number, but at least understanding what the different, what are the different sort of scenarios to state? What are the different populations that are stateless or at risk, so that some kind of policy response can be developed.
Yeah, I want to add some minor points on about the refugee participation in decision making. I think that's also another problem in Indonesia's practice. That we have, we face problem on excluding people into society from rule making, right? Can you imagine it's at the time when the making of the PR presidential regulation 2016, civil society only involved as the first step on the normative. It's like a informal discussion with the ETS or with I think the ministry of after the
kesempatan.
and then I have
Udah
also
selesai nulis sama ITM.
Not yet.
Gue juga
Far away.
baru 2 pembahasan baru kesukaan. Iya, tujuh enam halaman.
Not even 3 pages.
Seriously?
Yes,
The first draft.
By policy, right? But
You still have time to make
So much going on in the past 3 days.
I would ask a question. Probably it's related to work matters, but do you know what's Haidar been up to in
I never been, I think now, British should I find it in the formal foreign in Indonesians, like negative maybe or what.
What do you mean?
And also,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
we have also
yeah.
problems on that after the system of the new
what
government.
taking him
So that the refugee task force in the Ministry of Coordination
he's
Ministry of
currently
Nothing
projection
now since I
and
don't know,
it's
we
like
don't have
what
any
does he work
definitive ministry yet, and so it's not the priority.
He is our, general manager of competition.
Still not,
Something like that.
government in Indonesia is
And
negative.
right
So,
now
yeah,
is
yeah, of course.
with his team currently.
And I hope very much from the development in the local level,
Yes.
and they when they like see the touch with the
Yes.
local government, the immigration detention center,
Why you ask
in the
me
local
like
area,
that?
they
Is
maybe
there something
try
problem with
to
Haidar?
solve one
Like
administration and something like that.
what's
Then one more point is like that's why I encourage you to do study on that.
That's one thing. in the
We
past
haven't decided, it's really
2
good
weeks
topic, what Professor Porcelain
we
presented, right? We have some
kita
undefined, maybe
selalu ada acara
accountable, that we are separate
kemarin
population.
kayak aku lihat
in
juga ya di kalian itu pas
2012,
saya dari
when we have a
PSKN
new
nah ada band
when several people are going to be built outside the training center, there will be a lot of settlers display, I mean, from other countries. The one who do not recognize by their own country that they are the country and then live in the center at least 10 years. And after that, they can live outside the detention center. So we have also settled population with no connection with Indonesian ethnicity, and we have certain people in the eastern we have that we co-ethnic Indonesian. So it's just a topic to reason for the that
But we have to learn how to application because we have to get our 5 years have gone through this meeting. And I think before we have our discussion, then we say we of course to give up. It's not happy or just about the concept of election that you have a message for our students or anything else. So I really just want to say thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed this opportunity. I'm really impressed with you all. You have engaged so beautifully. It's wonderful responses to my questions, and then you asked some really excellent and insightful questions. So thank you very much for being here, for listening and for engaging. And I wish you all the very best with the remainder of your study. And maybe some of you might come to Melbourne one day to do a master's or a PhD. You have some great examples here. The same. Thank you once again.
And for me also, I would like to thank for the portal and for the team and Professor Nabita to come here from Melbourne. And then we, after I listened to the presentation, I realized a lot of things to learn about settlements, and it's very relevant. So thanks for the helpful presentation. I hope we can contribute to the vision. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay. Can I get started?
Well, we have a little group for you, and probably we'll give it to you, probably. To you, the company.
Ini jangan Q&A dong.
keluar bang
Pencet.
iya
Closing aja, closing.
udah
Okay. And now I will take all of you to take a photo together. Maybe you can take one together. Okay. Take a picture together. Yeah, everyone. Kita mau berapa? Ini baru berdiri. Boleh merapat ke tengah ya teman-teman? Merapat ya teman-teman, merapat kita foto. Yang masih di belakang boleh ke depan, ke depan. Okay, we're gonna do countdown. We're gonna photo 1, 2, 3. Okay, once again, 1, 2, 3. Yes. Look where I'm at.
Very hungry.